never before in the history of the United States, and certainly never again, had a place like Schilling Manor ever existed.
With parents in the service, they moved from town to town. They never really had a home, no roots to be found. The friends they made so quickly were the friends they lost too fast. That's the life they lived as a military brat.
Welcome to the Military Brats Registry, Every Brat Has a Story, podcast number 12. I'm Mark Curtis, creator of the Military Brats Registry, and your host. The Military Brats Registry is located at militarybrat.com. If you have questions or comments about this podcast or the website, please email us at militarybrat.com. We'd like to include your story about growing up military in future podcasts. It's our goal to record and preserve the unique culture and history of military brats. Send us an email with a brief description of your story, and we'll arrange a time to call you to possibly include it in a future episode. In 1964, as the first B-52s took flight in what would become America's longest combat mission, an old Air Force base on the plains of Kansas became Schilling Manor, the only base ever to be set aside for the wives and children of soldiers assigned to Vietnam. Author Donna Moreau was the daughter of one such waiting wife, and in her book, Waiting Wives, The Story of Schilling Manor, Home Front to the Vietnam War, Donna investigates an extraordinary group of women.
I would like to thank you for your book, Waiting Wives. I just started reading it, so the real meat of it is still to come. But I couldn't stop crying from what I've read. This isn't bad. It's therapeutic for me. I am currently a waiting wife. I wait for my husband to return from Afghanistan. I wait on a small post overseas, been sent to Italy with other wives. The reality of peacekeeping missions has hit the community hard this year. I am still reeling from the loss of one of my sister's experiences not too long ago. Thank you for writing about the unsung heroes in the military spouse and child. And I have to tell you, when I get things like that, I think, oh my gosh. I mean, this woman is in Italy reading my book, and she's a waiting wife and being affected by it, and it makes me feel so wonderful. You know, and when I get these, I think, oh my goodness, you know, when I first started writing the book, you know, it was all about me, right, and all about my family. And then, of course, it evolved into something bigger. It involved many wives and telling many different experiences. And then it turned into a story that was not only about the wives, but also about, you know, us kids. And then I thought, wow, this is great. I'm doing something wonderful. And then after it gets published, I hear from people like this, and I think to myself, wow, I guess it was a good thing to write this book, because it is sort of an unsung story, you know. Anyway.
Well, let's talk about the book. It's called Waiting Wives, and tell us what it's about.
Waiting Wives, The Story of Schilling Manor, Home Front to the Vietnam War, and it's about a small military community that existed during the Vietnam War that was set aside just for the wives and families of men serving overseas. And it came about in an unusual way, in that the military, as you well know, never really was concerned with where families went when a husband was deployed overseas. But as we started building up, as the American government started building up troops in Vietnam, more and more soldiers were going over, and there was Fort Riley, Kansas. There was a wife there whose husband was getting deployed with the Big Red One, and the Big Red One was like the first Army battalion that was going to have troops on the ground in Vietnam in 1965. And anyway, so she had some real estate experience, and she needed a place for her family to live. And so she heard about this small little Air Force base called Schilling Air Force Base that was closing down. And it had 735 Cape Heart houses on it. And she went, empty houses, not even 5 years old, lots of families needing places to live. And so we had her husband arrange a meeting with the guy who was closing it down, a guy named Colonel Scanlon, and he liked the idea, and he said, well, gee, maybe I can do this for our families, set it up, and he let 12 families move in, before he ever got approval. So he was, a brave soldier. And really what the story is about, it's a story about this community of women and children who lived there without their husbands. And so even though there was all of the accoutrement of the military base, there were no men. And it follows the lives of three women. My mom, because my mom and my sisters and I were stationed there in 1971 when my dad went to Vietnam. A woman named Lorraine Vogel, who was the actual, what I call her the godmother of Schilling Manor, because she was that military wife in Fort Riley, Kansas, who needed a place for her family to stay. And then the third wife, her name is Bonnie Johnson, and she was an MIA wife, and she chose to go and live at Schilling Manor 2 years after her husband went missing so that she could be closer to women who knew what she was going through. At that time, when her husband went missing, he was the fifth guy gone missing in Vietnam in 1965. So many of the people in her community, they didn't even know where Vietnam was on the map. So she thought it would be good to have herself and her children around a community where people knew where Vietnam was on the map and were in similar, although different, circumstances. And so the book follows the lives of these women from their decision to go there until they, for whatever reason, leave the post. So it's about their lives. And that's primarily what the book is about.
So you tell their stories basically through your eyes, right?
Absolutely, yes. I'm definitely the narrator. I'm the narrator, but it is their stories. It's nonfiction. There is a very small fictional section in it. It's called The Committee, and I decided to include it in the book because, well, one of the issues I had in writing the book was the fact that it was open from 1965 until 1977. I lived there for a year. The other women lived there for various periods of time. But what else went on there besides the lives of these women? Because I was working on the book for about 5 years, and much of that time was spent researching, and most of my research happened to involve interviewing people. Sidebar. And one of the ways that I was able to find many of the wives was through the children on militarybrat.com. So thank you for that officially. It's absolutely the truth. I was saying to a friend of mine, I was like, I don't know how to find these women. You know, my mother only stayed in touch with a few. And he said to me, because he was in the Military Brat, he goes, Donna, have you ever heard of militarybrat.com? And this is way back in like 1998. And I said, no, my goodness, I haven't. And so I immediately ran to my computer without stopping and found you, registered, did one of those cross-references of who lived where, and 140 people answered that they had lived at one point on Schilling. And so I emailed them and said, hey, I'm interested. I'm doing this book about some folks that live there, and did you live there during this particular time? And, I still communicate with some of those people. So actually it was a breakthrough. So that's my little sidebar. The book probably would not have been the same book had it not been for militarybrat.com. I probably would have found another way to do it, but my goodness, some of the stories were just wonderful, and so many of the women and the children were so generous with sharing their stories with me, and many of their stories are actually in the book. So there were so many stories that I had heard when I was researching that could not be corroborated. They were what they call secondary sources, but they really gave the color of Schilling Manor, how the women helped each other, how when there were commanders that cared, helped the women who were in dire circumstances. And, there were many foreign-born wives there who really didn't even know how to acclimate themselves to America and in the middle of Kansas. And so there were so many wonderful stories that gave that color. And I thought to myself, how can I put this in the book so that I have the stories, the intimate, personal stories of our wives, my three wives, as well as give that color. And so I came up with the concept of the committee because, when my mother lived there, she served on a waiting wives committee for this or that, and most of the women were very involved in the community. And there were always fashion shows and fundraisers for this or that. So I chose 5 women who are of different ranks because on Schilling Manor, rank didn't really matter because everybody was in the same boat. Whether you were a captain's wife or a sergeant's wife or a colonel's wife. And I put them together for a 5 or 6 week period and had them putting together a fashion show. And when they get done with the fashion show business, then they kind of chat about what's going on in the neighborhood. And it gave me an opportunity to tell those stories. For instance, there's a story of the farmer who came down from Lawrence, Kansas, looking for a wife because he had read about the waiting wives in the newspaper, and it was getting to be planting season, and he could use a good partner to help him plant his crops. So stories like that I'd heard from many different sources told in many different versions, had to find their way in the book, and the way that I did that was via the committee, who all of the stories are true, but again, can't be corroborated. So I put a little bit of a disclaimer saying there that these are stories I've heard, but the characters are fictionalized characters. So, and again, it gave me an opportunity to add a little bit of dimension to the book. And really show the community at work. And it was a wonderful community. Never before in the history of the United States, and certainly never again, had a place like Schilling Manor ever existed. It truly was, I think I describe it, actually I don't think, I do describe it as a Brigadoon community, rising from the prairie when it needed to be there, and then it, went away when it didn't need to be there. And it, and so what happened was is the way the military treated their families, the fact that we weren't at war anymore. Through attrition, the base eventually closed in 1977. But for, I would say 8 to 10 years, it was at full capacity with waiting lists.
How much do we see in the book of stories of the children?
Every single story has a child's story or children's story. It is hard to tell the story of the wives without also telling the story of the women. Of the children, excuse me. And that is simply because the women of that generation, which I refer to as the hat and glove generation of military wives, they were very committed to their duty to our country by serving, and I mean that in a positive, their husbands. And so almost every woman that I interviewed said, I just did what I had to do. They didn't think that what they did was, worthy of bravery or heroism or whatever. And so they were used to that lifestyle once they decided to marry in the military. Now, the children, they didn't make that decision themselves. They were sort of born into it. And many times the women would say, talk to my children, talk to my children. And through the voices of the wives, I am able to tell the story of the children because the wives were so concerned about the children, always concerned about the children. One of the wives, Bonnie, she said to me, everything I did to look for my husband, I did for my children, because it's them that suffered. It's the little ones who suffered. So it is called Waiting Wives, but their story is, in a way, about their waiting, but also about what their children went through. So it's become a family story.
Well, tell me about your own childhood and what your personal memories of Schilling Manor are.
Well, here's the interesting part. I lived on so many different bases and forts throughout my life because my dad was in the military when I was born in 1955, and that was at a time when rotations happened every 18 months, and if they didn't, it was every 3 years. But for some reason, we still ended up moving around. I was in 16 different schools before I graduated high school. I have recollections of many of those places, but not detailed recollections, and except for Schilling. And even though I never thought about it for years, when I decided that I was going to write something about being a military brat and being in the Army or growing up in the Army, Schilling kept popping up into my head, and I couldn't figure out why. And so this book is a whole investigation about why I would even think about it, and it's because it was a seminal time in my life. I was 15 and 16 years old. I learned to drive. My father was away at war, a very divisive war, and I fell in first teenage love there. And I lived there for 13 months, and yet it could be like I lived there yesterday, simply because I think it was so filled with emotion and growing pains. And I remember a lot of things. I remember sedans coming down the street. In fact, one of my chapters called 1 Minute is about a sedan that came down the street and its impact on the neighborhood. I remember my friend whose father, was wounded, and and her reaction, because I don't know about you, Mark, but we just went through life day to day. Our fathers were in the service, and so that was their job, and yeah, they were at war, but we were still gonna do our teenage thing, and because it was normal for us. Even when our fathers were at war, even when you were living on a military base where it was only women and kids. And so my recollections are about how my sisters and I used to fight. I mean, it was a very volatile time for my family. My mother was in charge of the family, really, for the first time. And we didn't go crazy because we were good kids, but we ate on TV trays at 6 o'clock rather than at the dinner table at 5:30. So our lifestyle changed when my father was away, and that was huge for us kids who lived in a very not regimented, because my dad wasn't like the general who came in and said we have to do this, but we lived in a very organized fashion. This happened at this time, and this happened at this time. And when my dad was away, we didn't have that much structure.
Why did you just decide to write the book, and how difficult was it to find some of these people who did live there?
Oh my goodness. Okay, that's actually a really good story, because it was. I decided to write the book. I actually was involved in the theater in New York City for many, many years, and I was a director and producer. And probably back in 1986, I said, I have to write a story about women waiting in war. And I was going to base this play on Schilling Manor. Well, that never came to pass. And then flash forward a few years, and I decide I think I'll go to grad school, and I think I'll go for writing. So I go to grad school. I need a project. And then all of a sudden, Schilling Manor pops up into my head again, and I think, oh, well, I could write my family story there at Schilling Manor. I mean, it's unusual, and I talked to my teachers about it, and I told my one teacher who was my mentor, I said, there was this place that existed in Kansas during the Vietnam War that was just for wives and kids of men serving overseas, and I lived there. And she went, oh, my goodness, this is a great story. And I went, yeah, it is kind of a great story. Well, I started writing my family story, and then she said to me, I wonder if this story is bigger than you and your family. And I went, well, what do you mean? She said, well, you lived there for 12, 13 months. The place was open for many years. What's the rest of the story? And so I went, oh, okay, what's the rest of the story? She said, you need to start doing some research. First place to start is to interview as many people who live there as possible. Well, that's easier said than done when you don't have the last name or serial numbers of the guys' wives, of the wives' husbands who live there. And so I said, okay, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it all the way, and I'll commit to it, and I'll tell my family story, but let me see what else is out there. And it was very, very hard to find those stories, Mark. I put advertisements in it was TROA back then, but the Retired Officers magazine that the Army puts out. I put little ads in the Army Times, the Air Force Times, the Navy Times. I put it out in the Enlisted Men's Journal, and I went on all kinds of Vietnam websites, and I did get some responses back and some wonderful interviews. But like I said before, it really wasn't until I got knowledge of militarybrat.com that I actually made some headway and really started meeting people and having them tell the stories. And so for 3 or 4 years, I traveled every couple of months all over the country to interview the wives and the children and the husbands of anyone who lived there. I went to Salina, which is where this base was located, Salina, Kansas, and I interviewed everybody there who had anything to do with the base, so that I could find out what my mentor and my teacher called the rest of the story. And it was from those interviews that I decided on what the structure would be, and that I would follow 3 very different women with very different issues, with very different lifestyles and backgrounds, to tell the story of this wonderful place that existed. It was hard. It was a very, very long process. This was my first book, so I really didn't know what I was doing, but I knew that I just had to keep walking forward, writing it and interviewing. And the story of Lorraine, who is the woman who actually founded the Post or came up with the idea, she was the biggest milestone in my research because I never thought that I could find her. And she was actually ended up being my very last interview. And I found her because I had done a couple of interviews on radio stations in Salina while I was visiting there and doing research there. And folks around the community and around the neighboring counties had heard it. And one of the women who heard it had lived there and had knew about the place and had kept articles that were written about it way back in the early days. And so she got in touch with me and sent me an article that was published out of the Milwaukee Journal back in 1966 that told of the whole history of Schilling Manor. And from that article, I was able to find Lorraine's name, and her name was Lorraine Vogel, that she was from her husband was from Fargo, North Dakota. And from there, I said, I wonder if they retired there. And so I got in touch with the Fargo newspaper, which is called Inforum, and I got a hold of the community guy and said, I wonder if you could run like a search or a notice saying that somebody's looking for somebody, that I was looking for Lorraine Vogel. And sure enough, he said, sure, why not? Gave him all of the details. And he ran it, and then all of a sudden I got an email from somebody saying, are you looking for the Lorraine Vogel whose husband is Bob Vogel? And I emailed back, and I said, yeah. And he says, well, that's my sister. And so I said, great, where is she? And he said, well, I'll give her your information. The next day, I get an email from Lorraine that says, I hear you're looking for me. And I said, is this the Lorraine Vogel who actually changed about 7,000 women's lives? And she said, I don't know what you're talking about. Because what happened was that she left after, her 13 or I think she was there for 15 months, and she never went back. And she never heard anything else about it. And when she lived there, it wasn't even up to capacity. They didn't even have a PX. They were just opening a commissary. They didn't have a dispensary yet. It was really an austere program in the early days. And she says, well, I thought they were going to close that place down after I left. And I said, Lorraine, let me tell you a story. And so I went and I told her, you have no idea the impact that you had on so many women's lives. That place, Schilling Manor, the home of the waiting wives of the United States Armed Forces. So I say that to her, and she says, wow, they called it that. They just called it Schilling Manor, Waiting Wives Home when I was there. And I'm like, oh, no, it's got an official name and all of that kind of stuff. And so I went to visit her. She lived in Texas, and we spent a couple of days together, and she just had one wonderful story after another. And literally, she was my last interview, and she was put into the book, within the last year that I was writing it. So it was very, very exciting. Yeah. I mean, really, I just couldn't even believe that I never in my wildest dreams ever thought I would be able to find this woman who I had heard about but never knew her name or anything. It was meant to be. It was just simply meant to be.
Are there any remnants at all of Schilling Manor, or has it been completely demolished?
Oh, no, it's there. I visited there. I visited my whole house. It's changed now. After it closed down in 1977, it went abandoned for a while, and then a railroad company took it over, and they took down some of the houses. Then they ended up selling it, and some private companies came in and bought the houses and renovated them for rental, and then eventually they were renovated again, and then eventually they were put up for sale as private homes. There is now in one of the communities, there's a nursing home there that was put up that's been there. But as a matter of fact, the houses are still there, the streets are still there. They've renamed the streets and everything, but the school is still there. I went to visit the school. It was very exciting. They were very thrilled to have me there because the school was actually in the book. My younger sister went to the school. But what's really interesting is that I just heard from somebody over email who had just bought one of the houses 3 houses down from where I lived. And the reason why the guy felt compelled to email me is that when he went down to look on his furnace, he says, I noticed that it said 143 Phoenix Street. Well, now it's Fairway Street, and it's a different number. He goes, where was that in relationship to you? Because he picked up the book at, where he lives in Salina. And I was like, well, I think you were about 3 doors down and across the street. So, so they're still there. And, of course, 35 years having passed, the trees are huge. And if you're familiar with military housing, as I'm sure you are, everything kind of looks the same. The bushes never really grow, and you're not allowed to put your own, you can't put a pagoda in your front yard. And, at least back when I was growing up, there was really no law that said you couldn't do things, but people just, didn't put bridges with lakes, with little ponds in their front yard. So each house has its own little individual character now. As when I lived there, of course, it was much more uniform looking and barren looking, and now it's lush with greenery and families. But it's there, and some of the old BOQs are still there, the community center's there, the gym is there, the old airport is there, and the airport hasn't changed very much.
So I guess you can go home again.
You can go home again, but it's always a little different.
Waiting Wives, The Story of Schilling Manor is available in the Brat Store of the Military Brats Registry. We want to hear your story, whether it takes 30 seconds or 30 minutes to tell. The Military Brats Registry podcast is one opportunity to share what you've held inside for years. Until next time, this is Mark Curtis for the Military Brats Registry podcast. Remember, every brat has a story. What's yours?
That's the life they lived as a military brat.